All right, so quadratic formula obviously is just for quadratic equations. Quadratic equation means that the degree or the highest exponent is 2. I've seen people do quadratic equations when you have like or quadratic formula rather, to the third power, fourth power. No, it's called the quadratic formula because it's only used for quadratic equations. So that's one method to solve for quadratic equations, right? So we've seen you can solve by factoring, and you can even solve by doing completing the square, which we'll do later. Those options, completing the square and quadratic formula, is just for quadratic. Okay, I'm done with repeating. So in order to do quadratic formula, super important is it must be equal to 0, okay? If it's not equal to 0, you have to make it equal to 0. How do I do that? Well, there's that -1 on that right side, and the opposite of subtracting. I don't know why I added it to 0. The opposite of subtracting is adding, right? So those three terms are not like terms, right? Because for it to be like terms, the exponents have to be the same. So I'm just going to write it like that, right? And then look at that, we got it equal to 0. So now that we have it set equal to 0, we can now identify what A, B, and C is. If you recall earlier, what is A, B, and C? A is always the coefficient of the x squared term. B is always the coefficient of the x. And C is called the constant, meaning it does not have an x attached to it. So again, I would recommend, I at least have my students just make sure you can get credit just by identifying A, B, and C. Literally. So the coefficient of x squared is 4. Be super careful. That middle coefficient there is a negative, and then C is +1. Now, what's really nice about identifying A, B, and C so clearly is that you can just pop it right into the formula. So I don't know why it switched to yellow. Let me do, how about blue? Okay. So now -b means doing the opposite sign, right? Or in other words, oh, that's why, because it's under my, just kidding. Okay. So that's say if I substitute -8 in the B spot, right? So that's actually saying -8. And when you have two minuses next to each other, it just makes it positive. So when you see the -b, just do the opposite sign. Okay, so that should be +8 plus or minus the square root. All of it is under the square root. You're going to be squaring b. Now, a very common mistake is I see people not put -8 should be in parentheses. It better be, because if it's not in parentheses and you're doing it on your calculator, it's going to give you the value of -64, and it should be positive, right? Because that says -8 times negative, which is a positive. Again, I go through all of this in detail with my course. So -4 times A, which was 4, and then times C, which is 1. Now, a super common mistake I see is people might just put that as the numerator, but be careful, it's all over. That's the entire numerator of the fraction, and that's 2 times A, which is 4. So let's take a look at the -8 being inside the parentheses versus outside the parentheses. So putting it inside the parentheses, that means you're squaring -8. So negative times a negative is a positive. But watch what happens when we put it outside the parentheses. You get -64. And the reason why it does that is because it's reading PEMDAS. It's reading as +8 being the base of the exponent. So it's doing 8 squared, which is 64, and then it's going to be doing the negative of that. So if you just make sure that you always put it in parentheses anyway, you don't have to worry about a thing, right? So if we put -8 squared in parentheses, make sure another common mistake is you put a minus sign, so -4, instead of people might accidentally be putting -4, and people will get tripped up on that. So if you do the square root of 48, if you notice, it's going to be a decimal. And what that means, if you're asked in the directions to do it in simplest form, is you should now be looking to simplify square root of 48. If you're asked to round to the nearest tenth, then that's fine. So to recap, whenever you're asked to give an answer in simplest radical form, if you noticed on the calculator, I did not do the square root. You only do what's underneath the square root, which is called the discriminant, by the way. And it cracks me up when people freeze on, oh, what does simplest radical form mean? It literally has the word radical in it, which means your final answer should have a radical in it. Radical is square root, by the way. So do not put the square root in the calculator. If the direction said to do it to the nearest tenth, then yes, then you would put it on your calculator. But we want to do simplest radical form, so we want to actually leave the radical in our final answer, right? So another common mistake is people might say, oh, look, 8, 8, and 48, those are all divisible by 8. Let me just divide everything by 8. You can't do that, because if you remember, I went over earlier, all three whole numbers has to have something in common. And if you're asking yourself, wait, where's the third whole number? I see 1, I see 2. It should be the number in front of the radical. Right now, there's an imaginary 1. That's the third whole number I'm talking about. So if you notice, because of that 1, now 1, 8, and 8, there is no GCF. So you cannot divide by 8. The second reason people might get tripped up on why you cannot divide the radical by 8 is because the whole number and the radical are not like terms, if you will. Okay, so you cannot touch what's inside the radical. So what are we supposed to do? As I said earlier, we're going to be simplifying the radical, which is what we did before, right? So you're looking for the biggest perfect square that goes into 48. Yes, there are there's I think 4 goes into 48, but also 16 goes into 48, and 16 is the bigger perfect square that goes into 48. You can do 4 and 12, right? Those work, but the thing is, then you can split up the 12 into 4 times 3. And if you're like, huh, what the heck did she just say? That's exactly my point. So to just not worry about all of that, because people get tripped up on that, just pick the biggest perfect square that goes into 48, which is 16. So now the entire point of picking a perfect square is it breaks free out of the radical. 3 is not a perfect square, so I'm just going to leave that as 4 radical 3, right? How do we know, by the way, that we are done and that we simplified it all the way? Is the number underneath the radical, you ask yourself, is there a perfect square that goes into that? And the answer is no, right? So you know it's simplified as much as possible. So now we know radical 48, right? If you do square root of 48 on your calculator, and if you do 4 times square root of 3 on your calculator, you're going to get the exact same decimal, okay? So we're not really changing the value of anything. This is all valid. So now look what happens. We now have a scenario where all 3 whole numbers have something in common. In this case, they are divisible by 4. Now we can absolutely take those 3 guys and divide everything by 4. So 8 divided by 4 is 2. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 8 divided by 4 is 2. So you do not have to put the 1 in front of the radical 3, but if you want, knock yourself out. So we're going to leave this as our final answer. So again, if you're asked to round to the nearest tenth, then you would just put all of that in your calculator. I hope this was helpful. So just a reminder, I left a link in the description. I have a whole course on all the prerequisite skills in detail, modules, lessons, homeworks, quizzes, warm-ups, stuff like that. So just as you would for a regular class. So as I said, I'll leave a link in the description onto my website, and I hope I'll see you soon.